SOS from Ourang Medan. We float. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room and on the bridge. Whole of crew dead. This was part of the SOS signal received in Morse code by British and Dutch listening posts in February 1948. Two nearby American vessels, the City of Baltimore and the Silver Star, were contacted, and acting as rescue ships, it wasn't long before the crews traced the source of the SOS call to a seemingly abandoned merchant navy vessel floating lifelessly in the Strait of Malacca. The rescue ships dropped their lifeboats, and several small parties of men cautiously rowed toward the barren vessel to investigate its decks and attempt to locate the crew. But once on board, it became clear that their rescue mission was far too late, as strewn across the deck were the bodies of the ship's crew, their faces frozen with expressions of abject fear, their arms still outstretched in front of them as if defending themselves from some unseen evil. And yet no man had any trace of blood or sign of injury on their body, and there was no signs of attack or violent struggle on board the ship. It was noted that even the ship's dog was dead, again unwounded and similarly frozen in time, snarling as if about to attack. The rescue party decided to investigate further into the ship to see if anyone had survived, and eventually they discovered the bodies of the captain, his officers, and slumped over his desk, the signalman. Once again, every man was dead and suspended in terror. As to be expected, the men from the rescue crews were both confused and horrified by the grim discovery. What in God's name happened here? They would have lightly remarked, but no one was keen to stay on board long enough to find out. After speaking with the captains of the Baltimore and the Silver Star, it was agreed that both vessels would jointly tow the dead ship to the nearest port to allow a full and proper investigation, and as such, tow ropes were tied and preparations were made. But almost as soon as the two ships were ready to depart, an almighty explosion was heard from within the ghostly vessel, and within seconds an enormous fireball engulfed the entire ship. The crews of the City of Baltimore and Silver Star quickly detached and abandoned their lines to allow them to withdraw to a safe distance, where ultimately they could do nothing more but watch as the ship, now completely ablaze, sunk quickly into the murky depths, taking its entire crew and secrets with it. And as such, the enduring mystery of the fate of the SS Ourang Medan and its crew was born. The story of the SS Ourang Medan is the 20th century's Mary Celeste, and has inspired around 8 decades of research, publications, conversation, speculation, and conspiracy. And in 2019, we even saw the first video game directly inspired by the mystery of the Ourang Medan, when developers Supermassive Games released the first installment of their Dark Pictures anthology game series, Man of Medan. But despite all this attention, the pursuit for answers has often created more questions. Who or what could possibly kill an entire crew of men with no sign of injuries and leaving them seemingly frozen in time and stricken with fear? Why didn't the crew signal for help sooner? Why hadn't the ship been ransacked? And what caused the enormous explosion within the ship's hull that led to its ultimate demise? Let's look at some theories. Possibly the simplest and most logical cause of death and subsequent explosion is a carbon monoxide leak, which some believe was caused by a faulty boiler in the ship's engine room. Carbon monoxide is a flammable, odourless and tasteless gas, which when inhaled in large doses can cause severe psychological and physiological symptoms, leading to a total loss of consciousness and eventually death. If the ship had a consistent gas leak on board, it is possible that the crew may have been completely unaware that they were slowly being poisoned, and as such could have been suffering from some of the many associated symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, eventually completely succumbing to the gas. It's theorised that as the gas built up, it eventually also caused the huge explosion when the gas was somehow inadvertently ignited, leading to the subsequent destruction of the ship. The Ourang Medan was described as a merchant vessel, and therefore it would be logical to assume that the ship was carrying and even possibly smuggling some form of hazardous cargo. Some of the most common materials that the ship is believed to have potentially been carrying include nitroglycerin, sulphur, and potassium chloride. All of these compounds, which have various applications ranging from medical to industrial, can also be highly explosive in differing states of matter. This theory states that at some point during the ship's voyage, one of the containers, either through accident or sabotage, had been compromised, and as such the chemical compounds were able to leak freely around the ship, either in gas or liquid form, subsequently poisoning the entire crew. As the levels of these chemicals gradually built up, it would have only taken a small disturbance to cause a cataclysmic explosion aboard the ship. Both the carbon monoxide and hazardous cargo theories are plausible, and certainly lend well to explaining why the bodies of the entire crew were all found on the main deck, as a sudden massive gas or chemical leak would have certainly led to panic and some form of evacuation, as the desperate crew rushed for the relative safety of the fresh air on the main deck. The incident took place in 1948, 3 years after the conclusion of World War II. And whilst the world was recovering from the trauma and extreme atrocities of the biggest conflict in human history, both the US and USSR were now locked in a bitter rivalry that would become known as the Cold War. Determined to develop and improve both their military and technological capabilities, Nazi scientists, many of whom were guilty of some of the most horrific war crimes of the Second World War, were not only offered full pardons, but were also adopted by both the US and USSR, allowing them to continue their wartime research and invention. Japan's Unit 731 was created by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1935 in a bid to create some of the most efficient and deadly chemical and biological weapons, and during the Second Sino-Japanese War, a conflict between China and Japan that began in 1937 and concluded with the end of the Second World War, the Japanese military employed scientists, doctors and military personnel to carry out a myriad of horrific experiments, using mostly Chinese and Soviet prisoners of war as their human guinea pigs. The estimated death toll of prisoners held by Unit 731 at the conclusion of the Second World War sat around 200 to 400,000 men, women and children, with the youngest stated in a 1995 booklet written about Unit 731 as just 3 days old. It's believed that over 3,500 personnel worked within Unit 731, and whilst several individuals were tried and convicted of war crimes for their involvement, much like the adopted Nazi war criminals, immunity was granted by General Douglas MacArthur to both informants and previously employed scientists and doctors of Unit 731, in exchange for valuable data and documents from the unit's biochemical weapons research. Similar to the more innocent hazardous cargo theory, after acquiring Unit 731 data and assets, the US Navy began transporting biochemical weaponry back to the mainland US, using merchant cargo vessels to remain inconspicuous. And as a result, the Ourang Medan was loaded up with some form of illegal biochemical nerve agent recovered from a Unit 731 facility, which at some point during the voyage had become compromised, and as a result, the entire crew of the ship would meet their almost instant demise at the hands of a powerful and deadly biochemical weapon. And as for the subsequent explosion, whilst this may have also been caused by the cargo leak reaching dangerously high levels and igniting, it's theorised that upon hearing that the Ourang Medan had been compromised, the US Navy may have intentionally sabotaged the vessel via torpedo, ensuring that both the illegal cargo and all evidence of their involvement with Japanese war criminals would be destroyed. Whilst there is little to no detail to suggest any form of paranormal activity that could have led to the death of the crew, other than an unnatural chill aboard the ship during outside temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius, many theorise that due to the fact there were no obvious outward signs of injury on any of the bodies, no obvious cause of death, and the fact that the entire crew were all frozen in time with terrified expressions, meant that they may have fallen victim to malevolent spirits, some kind of curse, or were even the victims of a hostile extraterrestrial visitation. But even if it's assumed that any of these situations could have realistically occurred, and a paranormal entity or influence had been aboard the Ourang Medan, this theory does not really offer any explanation as to why the ship also subsequently exploded. A pirate attack is a potentially logical theory, but it leads to a lot of less logical assumptions that are required to explain how a group of pirates could board the ship and overpower and kill the entire crew without leaving a single trace of damage, no signs of injuries or blood on any of the bodies or the surrounding areas, and no signs of a struggle at all on board the ship. Further questions are subsequently raised as to why, after massacring the entire crew, the pirates then left, apparently deciding not to claim the Ourang Medan as their own and not to loot the ship's cargo. All in all, this theory is both an impressive and also confusing achievement on the part of the pirates. But then again, as the saying goes, stranger things have happened at sea. Throughout this video, I have potentially deceived you, as the Ourang Medan in fact sunk in November 1939 near the Solomon Islands, and then again in June 1947 and February 1948 near the Marshall Islands. Or was it in the Strait of Malacca? Certainly it could not have sunk 3 times in 3 separate locations. So which is the real story? The earliest accounts of the Ourang Medan appear in articles in at least 3 British newspapers: the Daily Mirror, the Hampshire Telegraph and the Yorkshire Evening Post, all in November 1940. Whilst the Hampshire Telegraph and the Yorkshire Evening Post printed identical stories, the Daily Mirror went with a slightly edited, more summarised account. However, all 3 newspapers feature the same basic details and cite the Associated Press as their source. 8 years later, in February and March of 1948, Dutch newspaper Die Locomotief printed 3 articles featuring 2 accounts of the story. and it's the second account where the majority of the most common theories and information originates. Versions of the story then began to appear in various newspapers and books throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, including a letter written by the assistant to the director of the CIA to Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA at the time. And when researching this mystery, it soon becomes clear that almost all the stories, while similar, feature a myriad of conflicting details. The November 1940 articles from the Associated Press state that the story comes from an unknown source based in Trieste in Italy, in which the incident took place in November 1939 somewhere near the Solomon Islands. The recipients of the SOS message were Navy medical stations in Germany, Rome and France, who subsequently dispatched one unnamed rescue ship. The crew's cause of death was unknown, and the cause of the explosion was also unknown, although stated as an explosion coming from somewhere in the ship's hold. The first account in Die Lokomotive from 1948 came from an alleged unnamed member of the rescue ship's crew. They state the incident took place in 1947 near the Marshall Islands. The SOS message was received by their ship and forwarded on, although it doesn't state who the SOS was relayed to, and the crew of the witness's ship acted as the rescue crew. The cause of death again was unknown, and the cause of the explosion was linked to a fire in the number 4 hold. The second account from Die Lokomotive, also in 1948, comes from a missionary who allegedly spoke to the sole survivor of the incident before they died. The author of the account is stated as Silvio Shirley from Trieste in Italy, but it's not confirmed if Silvio is the missionary who heard the story or if he is retelling the story told to him by a missionary. In Silvio's account, the date of the incident is not mentioned, and the ship's location is somewhere between an unnamed Chinese port and Costa Rica, which allegedly was the journey the Ourang Medan was making, with the survivor eventually arriving in the Marshall Islands in a lifeboat. As the survivor abandoned the ship before the SOS was sent, no information is regarded providing the SOS recipients, the rescue ships, or the subsequent explosion. However, the survivor claimed that the cause of death was due to a mixture of nitroglycerin and sulfuric acid that he discovered the ship was illegally carrying, and that he had theorised before abandoning the ship that the nitroglycerin could lead to an explosion. An article in the Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council in May 1952 states the incident occurred in February 1948 in the Straits of Malacca, and offers no other information aside from the explosion was caused by a fire in the number 4 hold. British newspaper The Liverpool Echo, in an article in August 1955, also claims the incident took place in February 1948 in the Straits of Malacca, and claims that 2 unnamed rescue ships from Dutch Sumatra and British Malaya were dispatched. Again, the cause of the explosion is linked to a fire in the number 4 hold. In the letter to the CIA director written by C.H. Mark Jr. in December 1959, the incident is dated as February 1948 and again takes place in the Straits of Malacca. Mark Jr. also claims the SOS was received by Dutch and British listening posts, with the cause of explosion again linked to a fire in the number 4 hold. Mark Jr. goes on further to theorise on the paranormal as a potential cause for not only the disaster on board the Ourang Medan, but also for other sea and air disasters at the time, recounting stories dating back to 1067 of huge fireballs or glowing spheres coming from the ocean. And finally, if you'll cast your mind back to the story at the very beginning of the video, which is the most common urban legend retelling of the story, you'll recall the incident allegedly took place in February 1948 in the Strait of Malacca, with Dutch and British listening posts receiving the SOS, and 2 American vessels, the City of Baltimore and the Silver Star acting as the rescue vessels. With so many differing versions and accounts, some more detailed than others, it's almost impossible to confirm whether or not the story is true, especially when taking into account that the only 2 stories from alleged eyewitnesses date the incident as 1947, a full 7 years after the first Associated Press sourced articles featured in British newspapers. So far we've only dealt with words, and these have been for the most part unreliable and inconclusive in proving the legitimacy of the existence of the Ourang Medan and the alleged incident. So what other evidence exists? In the first February article published in De Locomotive, there are 2 photographs. The first photograph shows a ship keeled over on what appears to be its port side. The caption underneath translates to "The burned out wreck of the Ourang Medan shortly before it sank to the bottom of the ocean, taking its secret away." The second photograph features the image of what appears to be a dead sailor lying on his side, still holding the neck strap of his binoculars. The caption for this image states, "On the command bridge we found the second officer. He too was dead and did not reveal anything that he had died from." There is no source listed for either image, and therefore it's unknown if these images were taken by a member of the rescue crew or if they were supplied stock images taken from a photo library in a bid to aid in illustrating the already sensational story. Working on the assumption that these images are real, then one would assume there are more, and so I set out to discover what other photographic evidence had been recorded, and it wasn't long before the internet delivered promising results. If you type Ourang Medan into a Google search, you'll be met with 111,000 results, consisting of web pages, images, news reports, and over 30,000 video results. And of these results, there are several images used widely and consistently across the internet that purport to be real images of the Ourang Medan and its dead. First, we have this photo of the Ourang Medan featured, among many others, in a 2019 online article for the British tabloid newspaper The Daily Mirror. But this ship is also more commonly known as the United States Army transport ship, the Marine Jumper, which subsequently sailed under various names from the mid-40s until May 1988, when the ship was eventually scrapped. This is not the Ourang Medan. So perhaps this is the Ourang Medan, also featured in the same Daily Mirror article. But anyone who has visited and explored Lanzarote will potentially know of this ship named the Telamon, which ran aground in Lanzarote in 1981 and remains beached to this day. This again is not the Ourang Medan. But don't worry, the previous 2 images may have been fake, but the same article finally features this image, with the photo itself even stating that it is in fact the real SS Ourang Medan. At last, some concrete proof the ship existed. At least it would be proof if this picture wasn't a poorly doctored image of the Dutch passenger ship, the Zaandam, built in 1939 and sunk on the 2nd of November 1942 by German U-boat U-174. These are just 3 of the most common images that are widely misrepresented as the Ourang Medan, but there are of course more, hundreds more, all claiming to be actual images of the Ourang Medan, all of them misrepresented or fake. So what about the dead? As previously mentioned, De Locomotive also featured an image alleged to be the body of the second officer. And again, if we're to assume that the photo is genuine, more photos must exist somewhere of the bodies. This is the only other known surviving photograph of one of the crew of the Ourang Medan, their arms outstretched, face stricken with fear, frozen in time as if they died where they stood, dressed in their knockoff vintage Adidas Superstar shell-toe shoes. Shoes that in fact weren't designed and released until 1969. It's safe to conclude then that whilst this is an eerie image, the photo is in fact not one of the victims of the Ourang Medan incident, but instead is nothing more than an old abandoned mannequin which first appeared online around 2009 and is also commonly claimed to be a photo of Jean Hilliard, who had survived being frozen alive in Minnesota in December 1980. And whilst Jean Hilliard's story is true, this is also not a photo of Jean Hilliard. So far, evidence of the Ourang Medan has proven tricky to confirm, and this is especially made difficult by the sheer enormity of false and misleading information online. But there may be a reason for this deception. Earlier I mentioned a letter from C.H. Mark Jr. to the director of the CIA, Alan Dulles. Evidently the CIA were aware of the ship and the mystery, so were they involved in a cover-up? And is the theory that the Ourang Medan was carrying biochemical weapons from Unit 731 in fact true? Well, it's not entirely impossible to believe. In March of 1962, 7 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US Department of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed a false flag operation that would become known as Operation Northwoods. The purpose of Operation Northwoods was to stage attacks against American civilians or American military bases that would later be blamed on the Cuban government or Cuban refugees as a way to justify military intervention in Cuba. The document, which was declassified in 1997, is freely available online and describes a myriad of inventive and disturbing ways that the American military could legitimately fake an attack against their own people. Pages 7 and 8 of the document read: "A series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. Incidents to establish a credible attack, not in chronological order. Start rumour, many use clandestine radio. Land friendly Cubans in uniforms over the fence to stage attack on base. Capture Cuban friendly saboteurs inside the base. Start riots near the base main gate, friendly Cubans. Blow up ammunition inside the base, start fire. Burn aircraft on airbase, sabotage. Lob mortar shell from outside of base into base, some damage to installation." And the list goes on. In section 3, for the sake of the Ourang Medan mystery, the proposal suggests a false flag attack on a US ship that would be dubbed Remember the Maine incident. In this section, 2 suggestions are made to either blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay or blow up a drone vessel somewhere in Cuban waters, with the blame ultimately placed on the Cuban military. This would then be followed up with a staged rescue operation where fake survivors of the non-existent crew would be recovered from the wreckage. The document continues with other more disturbing suggestions where it's proposed, and I quote, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated." Thankfully, President John F. Kennedy rejected the Operation Northwoods proposal completely and entirely before any innocent people were massacred solely to provide false justification for military intervention. So how does Operation Northwoods bear any relevance to the Ourang Medan? Whilst it doesn't bear a direct connection, it's a document that shows the great lengths that the US military are willing to propose and go to in order to justify military actions and cover up the truth, both nationally and internationally, and therefore it's not entirely unreasonable to consider that the Ourang Medan may have been a victim of one such operation. We've already heard that following the conclusion of World War II, the US enlisted former Nazi scientists and Unit 731 personnel. Under the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the use of chemical and biological weapons were banned by the League of Nations, which would later be replaced by the United Nations, adopting all previous League of Nations agreement. Whilst the US was not a member of the League of Nations, they have been a member of the UN since October 1945, and would therefore be fully aware of the illegal status of chemical weaponry. This means that the US would have needed to transport any Unit 731 biological or chemical assets they had confiscated under strict secrecy, and therefore they may have enlisted potentially unaware and expendable merchant vessels to transport the goods. As a result, the US Navy would also likely be covertly tracking or following the progress of these employed vessels, and upon hearing that one of them, the Ourang Medan, had been compromised, the US Navy would likely have taken action to ensure their involvement with illegal biochemical weaponry remained undiscovered by sinking the ship and destroying its cargo. This isn't necessarily a far-fetched explanation to believe. However, it is more than likely nothing more than a conspiracy theory, as the first reports of the Ourang Medan dated the incident as November 1939, 2 months after the commencement of World War II and 2 years before the US joined the war effort. And whilst Unit 731 was created in 1935, the discovery of the unit and their atrocities was not made until August 1945, when the Japanese army abandoned and destroyed all of the unit's research and branches at the threat of approaching Soviet forces. The letter to Alan Dulles from C.H. Mark Jr., which is one of the basis for the theory of CIA or military involvement and a potential cover-up, is also commonly misrepresented, as the letter was in fact not written to Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, by his assistant, but was in fact written by C.H. Mark Jr. to the assistant of Alan Dulles, likely hoping that it would be forwarded to the director. The identity of C.H. Mark Jr. is unknown, but they were likely just a member of the public with an interest in recent mysterious sea and air disasters from a somewhat paranormal perspective, especially given the continual rise and obsession with UFO sightings in the US during this time. The mystery of the SS Ourang Medan is an incredibly interesting one, in which this video has only scratched the surface of theories and explanations. But the ever-enduring question remains, is there any truth to the story? Whilst the Ourang Medan does not appear in any shipping registers, the 1930 Lloyd's Shipping Register does list a Dutch-owned ship simply named Medan, built by W. Hamilton and Company Limited in Glasgow in 1908. The ship is listed in the 1930 to 1931 register as broken up in 1930, but there is evidence to suggest that the Medan and the Ourang Medan are possibly the same ship, as the Lloyd's Shipping Register states that the Medan had a gross tonnage of 5,933, and in the first account from the locomotive, the alleged eyewitness stated, "In detail, we found a pre-war statement that the Ourang Medan was a freighter of over 5,000 tons. However, in the very next line, the eyewitness claims that the Ourang Medan was also used as a Chinese troop ship between 1935 and 1937, 5 years after the Dutch ship Medan was listed as destroyed. It is entirely possible then that the tale of the Ourang Medan could have originated from the fate of the Medan, and from there, over a decade later in 1940, a small and possibly even misinterpreted or fabricated story from the Associated Press could have developed, and continued to develop, leading to an elaborate mystery spanning 8 decades. But without any living survivors to confirm or deny the story, and with an overwhelming amount of evidence against the existence and series of events aboard the ill-fated SS Ourang Medan, we're surely led to the natural conclusion that the story is fictional. And I believe that the newspaper De Locomotive, who published 2 of the most detailed accounts, said it best in their conclusion to their final article, published on the 13th of March 1948. It is obvious that the whole story is a fantasy, a fascinating romance. Thanks for watching, and once again, whilst I've attempted to include as much information and research as possible, the story of the Ourang Medan is vast and fascinating, and if you're interested in learning more, head over to the Things That Go Bump website for all my sources, links, and various articles and documents featured in this video.